snap. The kick is in the air, and the kick this time is no, sir-ree. No, sir-ree. Final score, Tennessee 20, Florida 17. Pandemonium reigns.
You're listening to the RTI Podcast, powered by RockyTopInsider.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome in to another episode of the RTI Podcast. I am Nathaniel Rutherford, managing editor at RockyTopInsider.com, joined as always by Ben McKee, our staff writer here at RTI, and we thank you all for being patient with us as we didn't have an episode last week. I don't know how many of y'all have seen any news or anything online, but I was in the middle of moving and stuff last week, so we've finally got everything kind of settled in and unpacked and whatnot. There was just a lot of stuff going on last week, packing up and actually moving along, so it was a busy week. And then also with just a busy schedule for both Ben and I, with fall camp going on and both of us going to practices and everything. It was just a very, very busy week, and unfortunately we're unable to get one tweet to you guys last week, but we should be able to get at least one this one right now, and hopefully two for you guys this week. And as the season approaches, we'll definitely be doing 2 a week during this season, having one on Mondays, kind of recapping the game and talking about our thoughts on the game. We'll probably do some kind of post-game reaction show of sorts on Saturdays, after the game as well. But we'll do something on Monday to kind of recap stuff and have more reaction to it then, and then probably one later on in the week to kind of preview the next game. So that's kind of the plan for right now. But as of right now, this will be at least one episode this week, maybe 2. But Ben, we have a lot to cover since we didn't get to do an episode last week, and there's just been, different tidbits, news and notes since we last spoke. Last time we did a podcast, fall camp was starting. I think it actually was just about to start. We think we did the podcast a day or 2 right before the beginning of fall camp. Since then, Ben, obviously we've had some guys kind of stand out and whatnot, but there's also been the unfortunate news for Tennessee of Emmett Gooden, defensive lineman who is penciled in as a starter for the Vols by us, by a lot of fans, by a lot of other media outlets and stuff too. He has gone down for the season with a torn ACL. We're still awaiting the news on Aubrey Solomon as well. That's another big storyline, and also one of the other big storylines is the health and status of Trey Smith. Is he going to be cleared to play? Ben, as you've noted in your practice reports, I think the last one you did for us, like last week over the weekend, he's consistently getting more and more kind of slowly integrated, doing more and more contact. He's still not doing anything kind of heavy contact wise. He was not cleared to go, I think, for the scrimmage over the weekend. So he's still very much up in the air. But I mentioned both Aubrey Solomon and Trey Smith for a reason to get to this point, and that is, I think, Ben, we may have been asked this question in a mailbag on RockyTopInsider.com, I think over the summer, kind of in June or July. And I'm pretty sure I heard you and Swain, touch on a little bit on the show before, but I wanted to have kind of a more full-on discussion about this topic here, as I think it's a very interesting question, and I'm wondering if the injury to Emmett Gooden changes your mind any. In your opinion, in an ideal world, both of these things are happening for Tennessee, and both these things would be good news for Tennessee, and they'd be able to get both these guys eligible and ready to go for the season. But if you could only choose one, if only one option were presented to you, do you think it is more important for Tennessee's success in 2019 to have Aubrey Solomon immediately eligible and ready to go on the defensive line, or have Trey Smith cleared to go and for him to be, a likely starter at one of the guard positions like a left guard? In your opinion, Ben, and like I said, I'm curious if the Emmett Gooden injury kind of changes your mind any. Which one's more important, getting Aubrey Solomon cleared for the season or getting Trey Smith cleared for the season?
Getting Aubrey Solomon cleared for the season, and even before the Emmett Gooden news, I thought that was more important, just because you don't have as many bodies along the defensive line as you do the offensive line. If Trey Smith does not play, yes, there will be a drop-off from Smith to whoever fills in at that left guard spot, whether it be Wanye Morris, who worked some at left guard during the close scrimmage over the weekend, whether it be Jameer Johnson, who has worked at left guard, whether Ryan Johnson slides over, although he's worked more at right guard, or if it's Jerome Carvin or Kayron Calvert, and they're moving guys around, the younger guys around, trying to find a good spot for them. Yes, there's a drop off, but I just listed 5, 6 potential options if Trey Smith can't play. If Aubrey Solomon can't play, there's no telling who is going to play defensive end. There are bodies there. It's just nobody has proven anything. And to a certain extent, nobody has proven anything along the offensive line either. But there are clear-cut options, and guys who have been talked about by the coaching staff who have generated some positive rumblings through fall camp along the offensive line, whereas the defensive line, when you hear folks talk about the defensive line, it's well, they look good in their uniform. That's not necessarily the situation you want to be in when you play in the SEC entering the season. So you have some obvious replacements for Aubrey Solomon. The first one was going to be Emmett Gooden. Obviously, that is not going to happen after he tears his ACL. But now the attention turns to Matthew Butler. He needs to step up and kind of lock down one of the end spots and run with it. You look at Darrell Middleton. He's one of those guys who's 6'7". You want him being the first guy off the bus. He's just a mean-looking dude, and if he can, I don't want to completely compare him to Daniel McCullers because McCullers was never really came out of his shell at Tennessee, and I don't want to say that Middleton is like that, has that big of a demeanor to him in the sense of not coming out of his shell. But at times he can be timid. At times Savion Williams can be timid in the way they go about practice, just kind of being unsure about things. And maybe that's simply because they're JUCO products and they just got here and they just completed their first week of fall practice. But they need those guys to step up and really take the bull by the horns and run with it, because the options right now are, it's slim pickings in my opinion, just because nobody has stepped up and established themselves. You have guys like John Mincy, who looks good, who could potentially make some noise. But it seems like the whole group is battling consistency. And if you sit there and watch practice, you can watch for 5 minutes and see that Aubrey Solomon and Emmett Gooden are by far the two best defensive linemen right now. Elijah Simmons may be the best defensive lineman by the end of his sophomore year, by the end of his freshman year. But right now, it's Aubrey Solomon and Emmett Gooden. They're already down Emmett Gooden. They can't afford to be down Aubrey Solomon as well. I think that could, to me, that's the difference in a football game on the season win total. That's the difference between 8-4 and 7-5 in my mind, or maybe 8-4 and 6-6. I think it's that big of a difference where the defensive line is right now. So I most definitely think that it's more important to get Aubrey Solomon back, although I do recognize Trey Smith is the better player. It's just right now there's not a whole lot of clarity along the defensive line where there is a backup plan for the offensive line. Tennessee's already on their backup plan with the defensive line, while the backup plan is somewhat established over on the offensive side of the ball. So again, I think it's more important that Aubrey Solomon is cleared to play.
I think this is an interesting discussion because I think honestly, you can make a point for both sides. Neither one would surprise me, or I guess I wouldn't say surprise me. But I think you make an argument for either option, and to me, you could be right, and I agree with a lot of what you said, Ben. I think you look at even before Emmett Gooden's injury, getting Solomon eligible was crucial because he brings a guy that he brings a body to the field that's been in a Michigan program that it's not. I wouldn't call them elite necessarily. They're not to the level, obviously, that Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, or Ohio State have been, but they're top tier. They're in the top tier, I guess, right after that elite status. They're in that next level of teams that could be threatening to make the college football playoffs and threatening to make a title run. So they have you'd imagine they have a very good strength and conditioning program, and Michigan's put out some really good defensive linemen over the last few years. So he's been in a high quality program there. He didn't, he flashed as a freshman. He got hurt as a sophomore and only played in a handful of games. But still, I think, to me, I'm going to choose, and I've thought about this for a while. I've thought about this a lot and try to figure out kind of where I stand on it. I think I'm going to choose Trey Smith, and it's because, like I just said with Solomon, we still don't know about him. A lot of the stuff with him is based on potential, based on, we think he will be a really good player. We think he will be a full, season-long starter and a guy who's going to be a big difference maker on the defensive line. And Ben, from what you and I have seen him in fall camp, I mean, he definitely looks like, one of the better defensive linemen on Tennessee's roster. He looks like he should be a starter if he is eligible. And the fact that I think he rolled a lot with the ones in the first scrimmage, I mean, to me, I think he will start for Tennessee. But that doesn't mean he's going to come in and instantly be a guy who's going to get, 10 tackles for loss or anything like that. It doesn't mean he's going to be a guy who's going to come in and be just a second team or first team All-SEC type of defensive lineman. We know when we've seen Trey Smith healthy, he is an All-American type player. He was a freshman All-American and when his first year at Tennessee in 2017. And yes, he wasn't to that same level of play in 2018, but there's a lot of different reasons for that. He couldn't go through, obviously, a lot of the off-season stuff. He didn't, I don't think, kept himself in as good of shape in the 2018 offseason as he did this 2019 offseason. I mean, you're just looking at kind of what we've seen from him so far in fall camp. Ben, I think that while he still hasn't been able to go through contact or anything like that, I think he is in better shape and better mental shape too, and physical shape both, than what he was this time last year. Obviously, we won't know that until if or when he gets cleared for contact, and if goes through scrimmages, and if or when he's able to play in that first game. But I just, based on what we know about both players, I'm gonna slightly side with Trey Smith in this one as far as which one is it more important that Tennessee gets cleared and ready to go for the 2019 season. I'm gonna say Trey Smith because when he's been healthy, he's been a major difference maker. And I get what you're saying, Ben, that there are more guys on the offensive line you'd feel a little more comfortable with when it comes to, if Smith can't play, you can put in maybe a Jameer Johnson at guard, or you have Ryan Johnson there, you have Jerome Carvin there, you have Ron Calvert, who's been getting some praise from Pruitt and the coaches and stuff so far in fall camp. So you've got guys you would feel a little, even Ryan Locklear too, but you have guys who you feel a little more comfortable giving the starting nod to. But I just think there's a big drop off between healthy Trey Smith and anyone else you're going to put in that position. I think Ryan Johnson is a better guard than he is center. I think he's he just played center last season after Brandon Kenny went down because Tennessee didn't really have anyone else to play center last season. I mean, they just didn't really have anyone else on the roster that could do it. And Ryan Johnson's a smart kid, and I think he's got maybe the mental aspect for it, but I just don't think physically he's as good of a center as a Brandon Kennedy, for example. I think he would be the guy you would turn to because I think he's going to start at one of the guard positions most likely anyway. It wouldn't shock me if he doesn't, but I think he's a good option to start at one of the guard positions. But as I look at who Tennessee has on the defensive line, and like I said, Aubrey Solomon I think is going to be a starter, but there's just, I just don't feel like we know. And maybe this will be proven to the season. Maybe Solomon will come out and he will be a second-team All-SEC or a first-team All-SEC type of defensive lineman. But just based on what we know about both guys right now, I'm going to side with Trey Smith because, like I said, when he's been healthy, when he was a freshman, he was a freshman All-American. And I know I don't necessarily think it's right maybe to expect him to get back to that level because of what he's dealt with, because of the blood clots and being here for the last 2 years, and because of just all the stuff he's had to deal with. I don't think it's maybe fair to expect him to play at an All-American level, but I think it would be plenty fair to expect him to be Tennessee's maybe their best starter, most consistent starter on the offensive line, assuming he can get in there and gel correctly with the other four guys who are going to be starting alongside him. But Ben, I think that either one you could argue makes sense, but I'm going to side slightly with Trey Smith just because, like I said, when we've seen him on, he's been obviously one of the best offensive linemen in the SEC and in the country.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's not a wrong answer in this discussion. If you tell me that we're going to get back freshman Trey Smith, freshman All-American, top 10 draft pick Trey Smith, I'm picking Trey Smith by a landslide. But in the SEC, it's hard to be at your best when you are not participating in contact or going through contact drills and participating in 7-on-7, 11-on-11. Obviously he doesn't really participate in 7-on-7 as an offensive lineman, but going through 11-on-11, it's hard to be successful in the SEC when you spent all fall camp not going through contact. I mean, that's the one position that you can't afford to miss out on the contact during fall camp, just because of the physical nature of the league and the physical, not even just the league. I mean, it's just the nature of the position. It doesn't matter if he's in the Pac-12, the ACC, the Big Ten, the Big 12, whatever league. You can't really be at your peak as an offensive lineman if you are not going through contact in fall camp. We saw it last fall with him, and maybe part of it was because he wasn't in all that great shape, but I think it really had a lot to do with him being rusty because he did not go through contact in fall camp, and so he didn't participate in Sunday scrimmage in any contact. And if it's a week and a half down the road from now and he's still not participating in contact, I think that's worrisome news in terms of Trey Smith playing effectively, playing to his full potential this fall. I mean, he can still play, just simply go out there and, be on the field and not having gone through contact in fall camp. But to be effective and be on the field, I think you have to go through fall camp and participate in contact drills and 11 on 11. And he has not done that yet. So that doesn't lead me to believe that we are going to get peak Trey Smith. We may in November, but there's going to be a grace period in which he is going to have to knock off the rust. And there's just no guarantee that we get freshman Trey Smith, which is why this is a conversation. If you guaranteed me that we do get freshman Trey Smith, this isn't even a conversation. I mean, he's the best offensive lineman in football, in college football, at least in the SEC. So it wouldn't even be a conversation. But just because we don't know if he's going to be available, because there are more offensive linemen ready to play than defensive linemen, I'm rolling with Aubrey Solomon. And I do agree with you. The jury is still out in terms of how effective will Aubrey Solomon be. There's a reason he transferred. He didn't live up to his recruiting profile. And while it was fair not to place the expectations on him coming out of high school, I mean, those expectations were there for a reason, because of his raw ability as a defensive lineman and his potential. And he didn't live up to it at Michigan, and he may have been slowed by injuries, and because of those injuries may have lost his starting spot, and maybe that's the sole reason he's transferring. And now under Tracy Rocker, one of the best defensive line coaches in America, he's going to take that next step. But there's no guarantee, like you mentioned. But I'm simply going with Aubrey Solomon because I know there's more offensive linemen ready to play than defensive linemen ready to play. And I don't know where Tennessee is going to look. If it's August 31st and Aubrey Solomon isn't eligible, Emmett Gooden has a torn ACL, and nobody has taken the bull by the horns and kind of run away with not even just three, just one or two of the defensive line positions in the starting rotation, that's not going to be a good sign.
This fall camp the next couple weeks are going to be very important. We had a question. I sent out a question on Rocket Top Insider, our main Twitter, asking for questions for our mailbag for this week. One of them I thought was interesting that Ben, I want to go ahead and kind of address here a little bit before we move on to our other main topic here on the podcast. But it was essentially, when does Tennessee, if they don't hear, if they don't hear back this week from the NCAA and Aubrey Solomon, when do they have to start preparing for the season? And preparing just like they're not going to have Solomon ready, just assuming the NCAA is not going to get anything back from it, that they're going to have to, he's going to have to set out the season. They're not going to approve him. When does Tennessee have to start preparing for, life without Aubrey Solomon in 2019? I think that answer is this weekend, this upcoming weekend. If Tennessee doesn't hear anything from the NCAA this week, I think they kind of have to, going into the second scrimmage, they're going to have to just start assuming they're not going to get them, and they can't just keep rolling them out there with the ones and taking away playing time from someone else, or kind of reps and stuff from someone else on the first team in case Solomon isn't eligible, because that's not going to be good. You don't have to have the same type of chemistry on the defensive line as you do on the offensive line per se. I think offensive line is probably the most chemistry dependent unit on the entire football team. I'm trying to think of any other one that would even compare to that, and I don't really think there is one. I think defensive line, you would have to have some chemistry there for sure. Guys had to take assignments and everything there, and trying to figure out who's going to fill which gap and all that stuff. But even with them, you have linebackers behind them who can kind of make up for stuff with the defensive line. So to me, though, it's still important that if they don't hear anything back on Aubrey Solomon this week, I mean, it's going to change what they're going to do in the scrimmage this weekend, because I don't feel like they could really put him out there and give him as many first team reps. I don't know how many first team reps he got on Sunday this past weekend, but to me, I don't think they could or should give him as many first team reps in the second scrimmage. They're going to have to give some to, whether it's more to Matthew Butler or more to John Mincy or more to, someone else. They're going to have to give more to somebody else, because at that point, you're 2 weeks, or actually, I guess 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks into fall camp. You're only 2 weeks essentially away from the season starting. I mean, you've got to figure out someone else on the first team, and assume at that point, I think that Aubrey Solomon isn't going to get cleared. Or if he is, I mean, I guess you would still feel comfortable enough with him getting the first team reps he's gotten. But I think, Ben, to me, if Tennessee doesn't hear back from the NCAA this week, that's when they're going to have to start preparing for life without Aubrey Solomon in 2019.
Preparation began in spring, in the summer, and if not then the first day of fall camp. And even just by the way that Jeremy Pruitt conducts practice and the way he divvies out reps, I think Tennessee has already began that preparation. You just have to plan for everything. I mean, it's why there's a plan B on the offensive line if Trey Smith can't play. Tennessee has a plan in place for if Aubrey Solomon is not eligible. It's just a matter of going out there and executing that plan. And honestly, we just don't know what that plan is. And honestly, Tennessee may not know that plan because, as we have talked about, no defensive linemen have really put one foot in front of the other and kind of taken on that task the way Tennessee may have liked. And so the way Pruitt divvies out reps, he gives the fourth string guys as many reps as the first string guys. He even gives the redshirt guys as many reps as the first string guys. That is how Pruitt believes you build a program, how you develop a program, how you develop the young players, is you give them the same amount of reps as the starters, as the upperclassmen. That way, when their time comes, they've had 1, 2, 3 years, however long it's taken for them to kind of get to the top of the depth chart. They've had those reps. They've had those experiences in practice. And so if you go out to practice and you watch the wide receivers, D'Angelo Gibbs, who is redshirting this year, is getting as many reps as Marquez Callaway, as Jawan Jennings, as Josh Palmer, even Brandon Johnson. I mean, D'Angelo Gibbs isn't going to play a lick this year. He's more valuable to the scout team for Tennessee this year, and he's receiving as many reps in drills and 11-on-11 as those starters that I mentioned. And granted, it's going to be different when they have a scrimmage because that is going to be as close to a game situation as possible. So as you mentioned, I'm sure Aubrey Solomon started in the scrimmage and played the majority of the snaps. But in terms of practice, the preparation for life without Aubrey Solomon has already began. And I think it's mainly a part of just the way Pruitt and this staff runs practice, that they give out the same amount of reps to the fourth string guy, the redshirt guys, as they do the first team guy. That way, when situations like this arise, I mean, they're ready to. They're not running around like a chicken with their head cut off. They're not panicking to come up with another option. At least at minimum, if there is a drop-off in talent from Aubrey Solomon to the next guy, at least that next guy has had the same amount of reps in practice and theoretically should at least know what to do mentally on the football field.
Well, Ben, let's get to our second main topic here on the podcast, because I wanted to kind of split time between talking about Aubrey Solomon, Trey Smith, and things we've seen in fall camp so far. We're about we're entering, I guess, I'm trying to think how many days this has even been. It's been well over a week at this point, week and a half of fall camp. They had the scrimmage on Sunday, a day off on Monday, and we're recording this on Tuesday afternoon. Ben, you're about ready to go out and head over to campus to go watch practice and give a practice report on RockyTopInsider.com. This podcast will probably come out a little bit before that, so if you're hearing this beforehand, go check it out. If you're hearing it after and haven't checked it out, then definitely go do that. But Ben, we've seen enough of fall camp now to where we've seen guys in full pads. We've seen a little bit. We've heard from the coaches, or heard from Pruitt at least, about how guys are progressing and everything. And I'm curious. We've heard a lot. You and I both have mentioned in reports and other articles and things like that too, of some of the guys who've been grabbing attention. Everyone has talked about, everyone's heard at this point. Guys like Eric Gray, Henry To'oTo'o, those are two of the young guys getting a lot of attention. You've also, obviously Aubrey Solomon's gotten a lot of attention. I even think you look on the offensive line, Amanya Morris has gotten attention. We've talked a little bit about Marcus Tatum, but I don't think he's gotten the attention of some other guys. But we haven't really talked a whole lot about Jarrett Garantano because he's the for sure starting quarterback, and there isn't really a competition there. There's competition with the backups, but we haven't talked as much about them. A receiver, Josh Palmer's gotten a lot of praise and a lot of attention, and that's nothing new. He flashed a lot last season and in the spring and practices as well. But Ben, I'm curious from what you've seen. I kind of feel like I know which direction you're going to go on offense, and I'll give my defensive guy here first. But I'm curious if there's a guy on each side of the ball. You don't have to give more than two if you'd want to, but a guy on each side of the ball here on defense and offense that isn't really getting talked about a ton, that you think is still going to have it doesn't have to be a huge impact, but you think it's going to have an impact on the season that isn't getting the attention of a Quavaris Crouch or Henry To'oTo'o or some of these some of the new guys or even some of the returning guys who looks like they're in line to have big seasons. Because one of the guys that immediately springs to mind for me when I look at that, he's not getting talked about a lot. And I think maybe the guy I'm thinking of on defense is starting to get talked about a little bit more now because of what happened in the scrimmage on Sunday. To me, I think a guy who, up until maybe the scrimmage on Sunday, wasn't really even getting mentioned at all, who I think is going to have a pretty decent impact on those defense this year, is Sean Schamberger. And to me, that surprises me because he was a guy who, Ben, I think you and I both expected. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think Jason Swain probably expected too. I think a lot of people expected Sean Schamberger to be a roster casualty after the end of the season, with the way kind of the Vanderbilt game went and him and Schamberger being what looked like to be in Jeremy Pruitt's doghouse for a while there. I was expecting him to be a transfer, a guy who you'd see his name in the transfer portal and that he wouldn't be on this roster in 2019. I give credit to him. I give credit to the coaching staff and everybody for kind of working out the relationship and getting things back on board there, because obviously he didn't transfer. He's still on this roster, and to me it looks like he is very much in line to either start or see a lot of playing time at that star position on Tennessee's defense. I think Schamberger is a guy who, like I said, I don't recall saying anything about him in any of our practice notes. I don't recall anyone asking any questions about him or really having much conversation about him until the scrimmage this past Sunday, because he was seen a lot in the, according to reports and stuff that we've seen from the scrimmage on Sunday. He was seen a lot at the star position, and some of that may also have to do with the fact that Alontae Taylor is a little banged up, and he's not been, playing as much or practicing as much as say a Warren Burrell. He's another guy. Warren Burrell is another guy who's been getting a lot of attention. Him and Bryce Thompson have been playing more of the corner spots, while Taylor's been kind of working his way back into full contact and everything there. But I think, to me, on defense, it's Sean Schamberger. I'll get my offensive guy in a second, but I'm curious if there's a guy on defense for you that isn't receiving as much attention as some of these other guys, but who you think is going to have a pretty big impact, or at least a noticeable impact on Tennessee's 2019 season.
Yeah, Sean Schamberger is one of those guys, most definitely. He would be one of the top three guys that I would throw out pertaining to this particular question. I think my answer is kind of funny in the sense of he's a senior and he's been here a while and he's not being talked about because he's just old. And we know how, things, I guess how our thoughts progress of people as they've been in a particular place for a while. It's like Swain and I were talking this morning after the show about Mike Tomlin. Like, it's already hard to believe that he's been here 15 years or been with the Steelers for 15 years. And we were talking about it in the sense of, there is a portion of the fan base with the Steelers that want Mike Tomlin gone, but forget just how good of a football coach he is because of how long he has been there. And so I look at Nigel Warrior, and he hasn't lived up to his recruiting profile, entering as a 4-star, the son of Dale Carter. He arrived at Tennessee with a lot of expectations, with this big legacy to fill. And quite frankly, to this point, he has not lived up to those expectations. And because he has not lived up to those expectations, I think he has been forgotten about. Now everybody's talking about in the secondary, Alontae Taylor, Bryce Thompson, Trevon Flowers, the young guys, Warren Burrell, Jalen McCullough. That's who everybody's talking about in the secondary right now, but they're forgetting that there's a fourth-year senior back there who has started and played a lot of football for Tennessee, has a lot of experience, second year with Jeremy Pruitt. I think he's a guy that's going to have a big impact this year. And I think he's a guy that just because of how many young guys are in the secondary, people have forgotten that he's back there. And again, I recognize that part of that is also because he hasn't lived up to his potential. He's missed a lot of tackles. He's dropped a lot of interceptions. He's taken poor angles in pursuit. So I recognize that has a lot to do with it as well. But I've been very impressed with him this fall camp. He's been very vocal in practice, especially the last couple of practices, showing a lot of leadership, getting on to his fellow safeties in drills when he's not happy with their effort, pointing out where the safeties need to be, what the safeties need to do, helping with technique, helping to get lined up, and he's just been really impressive. It looks like he's taken that next step, like the light bulb has finally gone off for him. Like it's just finally clicked in his head. And I think a lot of that has to do with working with Charles Kelly last year, Terry Fair last year, obviously Jeremy Pruitt now for 2 years, working with Derek Ansley. I'm expecting big things out of Nigel Warrior this year, and I think he's kind of the guy that's forgotten about just because, again, he hasn't lived up to the hype, and there's a lot of young guys at that position that everybody is excited about.
I think it's a good choice, too. I think Nigel Warrior, to me, I mentioned it, I think it was on Wednesday's practice of last week that, just from limited practice, we you and I both have mentioned multiple times that our practice reports been and the podcast and everything too. We don't get to see, anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes of practice usually, except for Saturday's practice where you got to see 6 minutes of practice been because they had one period open. But typically we see, typically we see 3, maybe 4, but usually just 3 periods of practice, and that's 10, 15 minutes of a nearly 2 hour long practice most of the time. So take everything you ever hear from us, from anybody else. And that's not the diss on anybody else. I'm just saying, take anything you hear from us or anyone else reporting on practice with several grains of salt, because we see only a portion of the practice. We don't get to see any game like situations usually or anything like that. We don't get to see very much at all. We see some drills and kind of individual drills, not really a whole lot of unit combination drills or anything like that. But in one of the defensive back drills I saw of last week, Jerry Pruitt was very, very praiseworthy of Nigel Warrior. Talk about he tracked the ball very well. We all know that catching the ball and tracking the ball has not been, I guess tracking the ball has not been the problem. It's been catching it and actually being able to pull down the interception that's been Nigel Warrior's issue at Tennessee. But Ben, you also noted in one of your practice reports late last week that Warrior was showing a lot of good leadership on the practice field. It was you mentioned specifically Jarrett Garantano and Nigel Warrior as 2 guys who were very vocal with their units, and Warrior specifically was getting on to some of the other defensive backs for not giving enough effort, for not showing the effort that he and the coaches are wanting. And that's something that I think just as a whole, not to get on too much of a tangent here, but that's something as a whole that I think you and I both would agree we've seen more of so far in this fall camp than we saw last fall camp, and maybe even in the spring a little bit. That's been more player leadership and more player accountability with the team. And I think you've mentioned it with Warrior. I've seen it with Daniel Batuli at linebacker as well. Jarrett Garantano on offense has done it. And I think you've also mentioned, Dominic Ward-Anderson at the tight end group has been doing it. So that to me is a big step in the right direction for this team as well. On the opposite side of the ball, Ben, I'm fairly certain I know who you're going to pick on offense. So I'm going to try not to step on your toes. I'm trying not to pick the guy I think you're going to pick. And I would agree with you if it's who I'm thinking it's going to be. But I'm a guy to me on offense who hasn't been getting very much attention, who I think is going to have probably a bigger impact than what people were expecting before fall camp. I think maybe now that we're a week and a half in or so, people are starting to concede to the point that I think he's going to have more of an impact than what they're expecting. But I said before fall camp, I think even when I did my projected, kind of depth chart projections before the start of fall camp, I had him penciled in as a starter. I'm going to go with Marcus Tatum. We got to speak with him. The media did, and he gave some good quotes. And he, I think it was on Tennessee's media day. It was supposed to be their fan day event, but all the rain and stuff kind of, messed that up. But he spoke with the media and talked about, how much weight he's put on, and he feels bigger and stronger now, and that there's more depth on the offensive line. But I think right now, if the season were to start today, he's going to be Tennessee's starting right tackle ahead of Darnell Wright. And I think to me, it wouldn't shock me if it's only kind of a matter of time before Darnell Wright kind of surpasses him. But I think Tatum has a leg up, and I think Tatum, he's not getting attention. You're hearing on the offensive line, obviously, it's Trey Smith, it's Wanya Morris, it's Darnell Wright, it's even Jameer Johnson's getting a decent amount of talk, and Cameron Calvert's getting talk because of he's a guy that hasn't done anything his first couple years, is getting more attention. Jameer Johnson's a guy who was a starter last year who, he could honestly end up being kind of the odd man out on the roster this year on the offensive line. I don't know if he will or not. We'll kind of see how that goes. But to me, the guy on the offensive side of the ball who's not getting talked about a whole lot, who I think is going to have a fairly large impact on the season, is Marcus Tatum, because I fully expect him to be the starter at least one of the tackle spots, probably right tackle to start the season. And it wouldn't surprise me if he's still starting by the time Tennessee's kind of midway through, or at least a couple games into the SEC season. I still think that Darnell Wright's going to maybe overtake him, but Tatum's going to be, to me, he's never going to be worse than number 2 on the depth chart at either tackle spot. So to me, he's going to have a fairly large impact on the season, and he's not really getting talked about a whole lot.
Yeah, I like that one. It's just I'm in the camp of, I think it's just a matter of time before Darnell Wright takes over at right tackle. I think by the end of September, Darnell Wright will be the starting right tackle. I would be a little concerned if he isn't. And that's nothing against Marcus Tatum. I think he has finally developed his body to the point to where he can go out and be effective in the SEC. But because of the way Pruitt, Brian Niedermeyer, and the rest of the staff has recruited, I think he's been recruited over. And at some point, talent just simply outweighs transformation. So I do like your pick. I just don't know that he's going to be starting by the end of September. But, hey, at worst, Marcus Tatum is a guy that can, if Darnell Wright isn't ready, you have a great second option. I truly believe that. At least a good second option, a good backup plan. And honestly, who knows? If left tackle isn't working out for Wanya Morris or Jameer Johnson, if Trey Smith isn't playing, if injuries happen to Jameer Johnson or Wanya Morris, then who knows? Maybe you slide him over to the left side of the offensive line. Maybe you slide him into right guard. I think Tatum is one of Tennessee's best 6 or 7 offensive linemen, no doubt. And I think he's going to play a huge role for Tennessee this year. The guy that you are referring to, the guy that I've been saying since the middle of summer, is Brandon Johnson. Led the team in receptions 2 years ago. Last year, his production was down. I think part of that had to do with the offense and the offensive philosophy. And everybody's talking about Jawan Jennings. Everybody's talking about Josh Palmer, Marquez Callaway, and Ramel Keaton is talked about more than Brandon Johnson. But I tell you what, in talking to Brandon Johnson last week in his media availability, the young man is just so impressive for a senior. You can tell that it is his last ride. You can tell that is sunk in with him. You can tell that there is a sense of urgency. He is so mature. He's just so well-rounded in terms of speaking to the media, and he's been so efficient in practice. He's not going to make the flashy one-handed catch like Callaway and Keaton did in the back of the end zone on a fade during Saturday's practice, I believe it was. It might have been Friday night's practice. But he's not going to make that catch, but he's going to catch the ball every time it's thrown to him. He's just sure-handed. He's just an effective football player. And if you go back and you look at the wide receivers from the 2000s, they always had veteran receivers who weren't flashy but just got the job done. And I think Brandon Johnson is going to be that guy. Callaway's going to make the flashy catches. Jawan Jennings is going to have the big moments, and Josh Palmer might be the most efficient. But Brandon Johnson is going to show up every single Saturday. He's going to give his all for Tennessee. He's going to carry out his responsibilities, whether it be a run play or a pass play, and he's just going to make the catch. And so I think Brandon Johnson is the forgotten man on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, that's exactly who I knew you were going to pick, Ben, because you and I talked about it, I think off record, I guess not off record, but just not online or anything like that, and I've heard you talk about him on the Swain event too. I knew that Brandon Johnson was going to be your pick, and I think he is a very interesting, intriguing one, because he's a guy who I think going into last season, I didn't expect him to have a monster year or anything like that, but I expected him to be more of a factor than what he was, because he obviously due to injuries and is due to just a bunch of different stuff with Tennessee's offense in 2017. He ended up leading the team in receptions. He wasn't Tennessee's most explosive player by any stretch of the imagination, and especially in that 2017 offense. Obviously, Marquez Callaway was, but then he kind of fell off the wayside by the end of the season. That was partially due to him, but also just partially due to the massive dysfunction of that entire 2017 offense. But Brandon Johnson, just for whatever reason last year, I mean, he just is a major regression. I almost wondered if he was going to be a guy who was going to end up transferring off the roster to try to go find, he's going to be a senior, so I thought there's a good chance he could be a grad transfer somewhere. I thought maybe he'd be a guy who you'd go see, try to find some playing time somewhere else, at maybe a smaller school, or maybe at another, Power 5 school, but kind of a smaller Power 5 school. But to his credit, he's stuck here, and he's not gone anywhere, and he's still fighting for positioning. I wonder, with Juwan Jennings kind of being hurt, will Brandon Johnson kind of fill in the same role that Jennings would play early on, while Jennings kind of, I wouldn't say struggles to get back, but as he kind of works his way back into, better playing shape. He's looked fine in fall camp from what we've seen, but there's been times, you watch the offense more than I have, but there's been times where you can tell that, his injury and his off-season surgery and stuff still kind of hampering him a little bit, but he's still playing through the pain, and he's still going to be, the guy who's going to be the dog out there for Tennessee. He's going to be the physical just presence out there that Tennessee doesn't have by anyone else on offense right now. But you have Callaway and Palmer, who I think will be Tennessee's two leading receivers at the actual wide receiver position, because I do think Dominic Wood-Anderson's going to catch a lot of passes this year, and I think Ty Chandler will catch a decent amount of passes too. But I do wonder what kind of role Brandon Johnson will carve out for himself, and I wonder if Tyler Bird's going to take a step forward. He's a guy that hasn't been talked a whole lot about this offseason like he was last year, because you saw him, see some time at defensive back briefly before being moved back to receiver. But he is obviously Tennessee's best blocking wide receiver last year. Does he get utilized more under Jim Chaney as an actual, pass catcher, or maybe a guy who's going to get some plays out of the backfield or on jet sweeps or something like that? I'm intrigued by both Brandon Johnson and Tyler Bird, because they're seniors. They're experienced guys who have been here for 4 years. I think Jim Chaney will probably get as much out of them as any other coach that they've had, because they've had a lot. They've had a lot of OCs. They've had a lot of receiver coaches. We talk all the time about this being Jarrett Garantano's fourth offensive coordinator in 4 years. This will be, these wide receivers' fourth offensive coordinator in 4 years, and I think it'll be their fourth position coach in 4 years. It's at least their third. I think it's their fourth, because they had a different one last year. Obviously, David Johnson's still on the team at Tennessee this year, but he got moved to running backs. They have Team Martin. Before those two guys, you had Kevin Beard as the receivers coach in 2017, and I cannot remember who was the receivers coach in 2016. It was not Azani. He'd left before then. So, I mean, that receiver position on the coaching staff feels like it's been a little bit of a revolving door for Tennessee. Hopefully, for Tennessee's sake, T. Martin can kind of stabilize that a little bit. Jim Chaney can kind of stabilize the OC position a little bit. But I think, to me, Brandon Johnson and Tyler Bird are two very intriguing options at the receivers position, that I think either one of those guys could be a guy who I would say obviously have a breakout year, but they could be guys who are going to be bigger contributors than what we're expecting. One other thing I want to ask you, Ben, because like I said, I know you've been watching the offense more than I did. I'm typically over on the defensive side of the ball, kind of keeping notes on that while you're watching the offense. Obviously, at tight end, Dominic Wood-Anderson's getting most of the attention, and deservedly so. He's going to be, unless he has some kind of injury, he's going to be starting at tight end for Tennessee this year, and I fully expect him to have a pretty big impact on what Tennessee's offense can do in 2019. But behind him, Ben, we haven't seen, to me, I don't think there's a clear-cut number two. Austin Pope kind of fell out of favor with the team last year, with the coaching staff last year, after his just, very unfortunate fumble against Florida. And then even after that, he was just never kind of consistent enough to really, get a ton of playing time. But then after that fumble out of the back of the end zone, that kind of, it benched him for a little bit, and he kind of played a little more later on this season. But he's just, to me, not quite big enough, and he's battled with injuries. To me, Jacob Warren is a really, intriguing pass catching option, but he's still, in my opinion, not big enough and not maybe physical enough to be another blocker kind of guy that if you're going to have a two tight end set, that you want to have him out there. I haven't heard very much about Princeton Fant. That leaves, two of the freshmen and also Andrew Craig. So, Ben, I know when you wrote your tight end position preview before fall camp, you'd mentioned Andrew Craig as maybe the guy to kind of watch as maybe the number 2 option. I'm curious, as we've been through kind of a week and a half of fall camp so far, what have you seen out of that tight end group of, behind Dominic Wood Anderson? Have you really seen anyone kind of develop as the true number 2 tight end guy over there?
Yeah, I think Tennessee has 3 number 2 options, if that makes sense. Dominic Wood Anderson is obviously the go-to tight end, starting tight end. He is the alpha male of that room. Just you can tell by watching practice. I mean, he's vocal. He's trying to encourage his teammates, give out pointers, give out tips, and behind him there's a drop off. But I do think there are a couple of names to watch for. I really like Jacob Warren and Princeton Fant. I think those two have put on a lot of muscle. Princeton Fant, maybe a little bit on the shorter side, but he's rock solid. Jacob Warren, I mean, he's a terrific pass catcher. He might be the best pass catcher in the entire room. You go back to his days at Farragut High School here in Knoxville, and he was on SportsCenter top 10 plays. I believe it was twice. I know once, but at least twice for just making ridiculous catches. So he may be the best pass-catching option, but unfortunately for him, he was a little light in the pants when he arrived on campus. And on top of that, Jeremy Pruitt, his tight ends, he wants the tight ends to be a better blocker than a pass catcher. Catching passes comes second to Jeremy Pruitt's tight ends. That is just his philosophy. He wants to run the ball, and he wants the tight ends to play a critical part in helping the running game be successful. So in running situations, it's Dominic Wood Anderson, and then 2 and 3, I think it'll be Princeton Fant, who is rock solid in terms of just the way his body is built, has a lot of muscle, and then Andrew Craig, who was effective at times last year and has looked good so far in fall camp as well. Now, if it's a passing situation, I think you'll see Jacob Warren in there alongside Dominic Wood Anderson. So I like that foursome, so to speak, of guys to where obviously Dominic Wood Anderson is, if there's one tight end in the game, then obviously it's going to be DWA. But I do think Tennessee has several pretty good options for that number 2 and that number 3 spot. And the first couple of names I'm looking at to back up those guys is Jacob Warren, Andrew Craig, Princeton Fant, as I mentioned. And then I do think at some point you'll see the freshman, Sean Brown, Jackson Lowe potentially, get in the mix. But I think right now they're treading water simply because they're freshmen going through the first fall camp. And once they're comfortable with practice and the playbook and going about their business as a college athlete, I think they'll be okay. But right now, those are the guys that I'm looking at. And then you still have Austin Pope, who's a redshirt junior, has played a good bit of football. Jeremy Pruitt's staff really liked him when they stepped foot on campus last year. But he just did not have a good year last year, and part of that is because of back injuries, like Austin Price said on the Swain event this morning. But he's a guy that could factor into the rotation, although personally, I don't know how the staff feels. Obviously, I'd love to know their honest opinion, but I like Princeton Fant and Andrew Craig and Jacob Warren as that backup tight end.
I think to me that is an intriguing battle to kind of watch. We talked, I think, the last podcast about position battles to watch in fall camp. And I don't think we mentioned kind of that backup tight end spot because we mentioned a backup spot for quarterback. Obviously, that's to me one of the bigger ones to keep an eye on. But I think that number 2 tight end spot is an intriguing one because, like you said, I think they do value blocking more. But I was a big fan of Jacob Warren when Tennessee signed him. And I didn't expect him, obviously, to play last year because he needed to add on weight, and he didn't. He redshirted last season. But I do wonder with Jim Chaney, I don't think you'll see him get a lot of run this year, but I do wonder what his ceiling is like under a Jim Chaney run offense, maybe next season in 2020, because at that point you'd think Warren, will have even more kind of 10, 15 more pounds added on and still be able to do a lot of things he does. Even just only, 5 to 8 pounds, it's still more, more mass, more strength that he's going to have. I think he's, to me, a guy who I'm excited to see as a pass-catching option as his career progresses at Tennessee. I don't know necessarily about this season, but I'm very intrigued by that tight end spot behind Dominic Wood Anderson, and I want your thoughts on it because, like I said, I know you've watched the offense more than I have because I've focused mostly on defense. But I think that'll be where we'll end this podcast. Be on the lookout, hopefully later on this week, for a second one from us here at RTI. And Ben, hopefully we'll get some news on either Aubrey Solomon or Trey Smith, or maybe both. Maybe Tennessee will get good news on both those guys' fronts, maybe only one of them. But either way, hopefully, if it's good or bad, it would be nice for Tennessee to know one way or the other here in the next 7, at the most you'd think 10 days, but here in the next 4, 5, 6 days would be more ideal than not. But we'll let you know if there's any news like that. We'll have it updated as soon as we know on RockyTopInsider.com. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, where it's at Rocky Top Insider on all of those as well. You subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a new way to experience the podcast. And we also have a lot of different video content for you, whether it's interviews with the coaches, with players, or practice videos, practice highlights we've been putting up there after practice as well. You can check it out, just Rocky Top Insider on YouTube. We have the podcast up that way. We also have the RTI Recruiting Podcast that's back. It is on YouTube. It is on our podcast tab as well. If you have an Apple device, an iPhone, an iPad, or an Android device, either one, you can subscribe to us that way. Either device that you have, it's Apple Podcasts on your Apple device, and also whatever kind of podcast catcher or podcast app you use on your Android, we're accessible that way as well. But until next time, this has been another episode of the RTI Podcast.